We Shall Overcome Chapter 20, Part 2. We ended last lesson, just as we were getting into Birmingham, Alabama. Now, Birmingham, Alabama is in the heart of the Deep South. She's known as the Powder Keg because she is one of the most racist, segregated cities in the entire country. They were so radical that they even outlawed the NAACP as being communistic. And there were so many bombs going off, with predominantly black targets, it was known as Birmingham. And they had a police commissioner called Bull Connor. To say he was an extreme racist is, put it mildly, the man was absolutely nuts. But he did have a booming voice, and people were afraid of him. And Reverend Martin Luther King called for demonstrations there because he said a victory in Birmingham would be a giant step to end segregation. So they got together and they made plans for demonstrations, and they called it Project C for confrontation in Birmingham. And the original plan was to behave as Albany Sheriff had done. No violence in front of the camera, and you take the people who've been arrested inside one door and out the back door and take them to another jail. And Mr. Connor actually gave orders that, no violence in front of the cameras and treat the demonstrators with respect. But, well, the demonstrations continued and kept growing larger, and he finally lost his cool. So he ordered the demonstrators to be attacked with clubs and dogs or anything else. Well, that broke up that demonstration, of course, but it didn't stop them because they came back a few days later. So he said, okay, now these people are supposedly law-abiding, and they want to obey the law, so we'll go to court and we'll get an injunction to stop the demonstrations because they're, creating a civil disturbance. We got the injunction, he told leaders about it, and they just ignored it. And they showed up again. Only this time, Martin Luther King was leading them. And, of course, he got arrested. And it was during this period that he wrote that very famous letter from Birmingham jail, where he was denying that they were outside agitators, that they were there merely to try to gain some civil rights and equality for the black race. Well, when you take off work to go demonstrate, you don't get paid. And if you're not getting paid, you can't pay your rent or buy groceries. So it starts, we're not accomplishing anything. All I'm doing is losing pay. So what are we going to do? Okay, let's involve the children. Well, I think you all are well aware of how I feel about involving children in anything that's going to cause them to be harmed. But they were the opinion that Bull Connor wouldn't use dogs against the kids. Surely not. And when it started out, it was just a few dozen of them walking up and down the street with their pickets. But whether it was because they thought they were really accomplishing something, whether they were having fun, taking a day off skipping school with permission, whatever the reason, the demonstrations grew. And from a few dozen, it grew to several hundreds, and then 1,000 or more. And it seemed like every school in town had black students. The students weren't going to school. They were going to the black church to find out where to go to demonstrate. Well, Connor ordered them to disperse, and when they didn't, he ordered fire hoses and dogs. Now, I'm going to try this. I've tried it in the past, and it hasn't worked, but let's see what happens now.
You can never whip these birds if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
In May of 1963, one individual in Birmingham, Alabama reinvigorated the wilting civil rights movement. Bull Connor, Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety, ordered the use of fire hoses and police dogs to quell demonstrations pushing for desegregation in Birmingham. In an ironic twist, however, by defending segregation so fervently, Bull Connor actually called national attention to the civil rights movement and dramatized its goals. His violent actions brought the immediate end to segregation in Birmingham, solidified his legacy as a symbol of bigotry, and, most importantly, hastened the passage of major civil rights legislation. Starting in the 1950s, dramatic changes began to sweep the entire nation. Following the landmark decision in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 and the success of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956, America found itself amidst an ever-strengthening civil rights movement. In 1962, however, the movement met its first significant setback in Albany, Georgia. The Albany movement was largely a failure. Because it lacked a clear-cut focus and failed to arouse an aggressive response from the police department, the campaign stalled. In August of 1962, the leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., left the city of Albany. According to King, the Albany movement's aims were so vague that we got nothing, and the people were left depressed and in despair. Although King left Albany crestfallen, he quickly refocused his attention on finding a way to regain momentum. King and other civil rights leaders sought someone that would display to the world the grim reality of segregation in the South. It didn't take long to find such an individual. Born in 1897, Theophilus Eugene Connor achieved local fame in Birmingham after dropping out of high school and becoming a baseball radio announcer in 1921. Due to his booming voice, Connor earned the nickname Bull, and eventually became, according to one publication, one of Dixie's most popular announcers. In 1934, Bull Connor launched his career in politics by becoming a member of the Alabama House of Representatives. According to Connor, he ran partly for the fun of it and partly to see how many friends I had. Despite his superficial motives and modest beginnings, Connor eventually would become one of the most infamous men in the South. By 1963, Connor had already gained his reputation for defending segregation at all costs. Over the past 2 decades, he had dominated Birmingham's political scene. Serving as the Commissioner of Public Safety, Connor controlled both the police department and the fire department. Connor frequently used his power to enforce Birmingham's stringent segregation ordinances, or, as he referred to them, our way of life. Bull Connor's Birmingham had become an international symbol of segregation and racism. The city was referred to as Bombingham for the numerous unsolved bombings by the Ku Klux Klan during Connor's reign. In 1962, Connor ordered the closure of over 60 of Birmingham's parks rather than follow a court's order to desegregate public facilities. According to Dr. King, Birmingham was the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States. After the failure of the Albany movement, local civil rights leaders implored Dr. King to make Birmingham the next target of the civil rights movement. The Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth told King, "If you come to Birmingham, the movement can not only gain prestige, it can really shake the country." With such a strong incentive, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference began planning for the campaign in Birmingham. It would be called Project C, for confrontation.
I have the feeling that if we can get a breakthrough in Birmingham and really break down the walls of segregation, it will demonstrate to the whole South, at least the hardcore South, that it can no longer resist integration.
Since African Americans comprise 40% of the consumer population in Birmingham, the SCLC decided to target segregation primarily in the business section of the city through economic boycott and prolonged demonstrations. The leaders of Project C also hoped that it would serve as a template for future resistances in southern cities. According to Shuttlesworth, "We wanted confrontation, nonviolent confrontation, to see if it would work on a massive scale, not just for Birmingham, for the nation." After small-scale demonstrations in April, the leaders of Project C decided to use a revolutionary new tactic. The final phase of the movement would focus on mobilizing hundreds of Birmingham's youth. On Thursday, May 2nd, the first children began demonstrating. By the end of the day, Bull Connor and his police force had arrested 959 children, ranging from ages 6 to 18. Over the next few days, Connor continued defending segregation at all costs.
Do you think you can keep Birmingham in the present situation of segregation?
I may not be able to do it, but I'll die trying.
Connor ordered his police and fire departments to use dogs and hoses to crush these massive demonstrations. To counter King's tactic of nonviolence, Connor pledged to fill the jails. By May 7th, Connor and his police department had already jailed over 3,000 demonstrators. The situation in Birmingham worsened as Connor proceeded with his relentless attack on the demonstrators. Local business leaders began to change their minds about segregation. Because of the economically crippling effect of the boycott and the state of race relations, the Senior Citizens Committee, a group that represented the majority of Birmingham's businesses, agreed to desegregate lunch counters and hire African American workers. Announced on May 10th, the Birmingham Agreement struck an enormous blow for integration. Bull Connor's extreme actions had clearly backfired. But his violent actions would eventually backfire even more.
Bull Connor's recalcitrant behavior and positions allowed the press to be able to focus thoroughly on what was happening within a movement experience.
Over 200 reporters from local and national media outlets captured Connor's segregationist tactics in pictures and video. The stark contrast of vicious dogs and high-powered hoses with young children dramatically stirred the nation's conscience. As Connor attacked the Birmingham Agreement as capitulation by certain weak-kneed white people, President John F. Kennedy began preparing for a monumental address to the nation. Previously, Kennedy had taken a rather lackluster stance on civil rights for African Americans. However, Bull Connor's alarming actions in Birmingham had alerted Kennedy, along with millions of other Americans, of the dire situation in the South. On June 11, 1963, Kennedy delivered an address on civil rights to the nation.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them. Please, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
Using the momentum from the events in Birmingham, over 250,000 Americans participated in the March on Washington in August of 1963, rallying behind a cry to pass the bill. A year later, President Lyndon Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The act, which was originally proposed because of Bull Connor's aggressive defense of segregation, outlawed segregation in schools, public places, and employment, and was an enormous step towards equality between different races. On March 10, 1973, Eugene Bull Connor died. By this time, Connor had lost nearly all of his political power and remained in the minds of Americans as a racist leader in the South. But for the Civil Rights Movement, Connor was so much more than that. Connor became the quintessential representation of racism and prejudice in the South. By pledging to defend segregation at all costs, Connor was the perfect individual around whom the Civil Rights Movement could rally. His attention-grabbing actions were of the utmost of importance for the movement. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Connor's use of fire hoses and police dogs on demonstrators not only caused the immediate end of segregation in Birmingham, but also triggered a sequence of events, from Kennedy's proposal of a major civil rights bill to the March on Washington, that directly led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Connor's story demonstrates how one individual's actions have the power to influence popular opinion and call attention to inequalities in our world. After Connor's downfall, one periodical discussed his influence in Birmingham. Without Bull dominating the Birmingham scene, race relations in the city would have been far in advance of what they are, for in season and out he gave encouragement, aid, and comfort to the intellectually prehistoric mass mobs who have shot, bombed, and persecuted Negro citizens in an effort to thwart their advance to full manhood status. What this author could not understand, however, was just how crucial Connor's role was in advancing race relations in not only Birmingham, but in the whole nation. Connor has been called the perfect adversary because he embodied all of the ugliness of segregation in the hardcore South. Pictures of his racist actions alerted the nation of the inequality in everyday life in the South and led to an unanticipated revival in the previously wilting civil rights movement. Reflecting back on the events in Birmingham, President Kennedy remarked on the importance of Connor in the civil rights movement. He said, "The civil rights movement should thank God for Bull Connor. He's helped it as much as Abraham Lincoln."
Well, it seems to have worked. Now let's just hope that YouTube will process it. But as a result of all that film coverage, donations poured in by the thousands of dollars, and they were able to bail most of the people out of jail. And as the film just showed you on May the 10th, an agreement with the city and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to desegregate certain areas and hire blacks within 90 days. It was a great victory for King and the movement, but bombs kept going off. And finally, President Kennedy had to order federal troops in outside the city to try to maintain some type of calm. But then in September of '63, a black church was bombed and 4 little girls were killed. This is a picture of some of the devastation and the 4 little girls. I mean, they were very young. They were preteens. Now, I'm not going to go into the Freedom Summer of '64 because that's what your Eyes on the Prize YouTube is about. But do pay attention to the name Fannie Lou Hamer. She gained state and national stature this time as a leader of the movement, and you're going to hear more about her later in the chapter. But the Selma to Montgomery, Alabama March in March of 65. They were going to try to demonstrate the inequality of not being able to register to vote because of all the regulations. And when a black civil rights worker was killed protecting his mother, they decided to use the march as a protest of his death, plus a denial of voting rights. And of course, the marchers were met with 150 club-swinging police, and action caught on TV, and a white minister from the Northeast was killed. So the first march was called Bloody Sunday. It did take 2 more attempts before successful. And the third march, there was over 3,000 members, black, white, men, women, old, young. There were even some celebrities from Hollywood there. And President Johnson called out the National Guard for their protection. Now I'm going to stop here and finish the chapter without lengthy videos next lesson. Then we'll have our test. So it looks like next lesson is going to be kind of busy. Thank you for being patient.